Hey guys, welcome back. And today I've actually got a brother named Mark McDonnell. He's in Kyiv, Ukraine. And of course, with all the
Mhm.
things swirling around about Ukraine and Russia and the war going on, I thought it would be productive to actually have a conversation with someone on the ground who actually has a perspective, at least a Christian perspective of what's taking place, his interaction. He's been there for quite some time, but I'll let him share all that with you. But obviously, today is talking about Ukraine and Russia and the war that's going on, and of course, the Christian community there. So let's just jump right into it. So, Mark, welcome
Thank
to
you.
my show, I guess, and thank you for giving me some time. So, let's just get started first by you just sharing who you are, where you're from, why in the world are you in Kiev to begin with?
Right. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. My wife and I were both born in Houston, Texas. We met at the University of Houston and at the Baptist Student Union, where we both got involved in ministry and looked around and kept seeing each other. And so we got married, and just as finding ministry is a common thing between us, and we went. I had wanted to go into ministry. My father was a pastor for 36 years, and we went to Dallas Theological Seminary. And while we were there, we thought we wanted to go into missions, but weren't exactly sure what that would look like. But the Lord allowed us to meet some Ukrainians. These Ukrainians had been sent by the churches here in Ukraine to go to Dallas Seminary to get training in Bible and theology, ministry, things like that, in order to come back to Ukraine to start a school to train others for ministry. And they invited us to come along. And we decided to take them up on that. And so we arrived in Ukraine in 1998, and we've been here ever since. We arrived with three kids and raised our kids here, and coming up on 27 years. And it's just been an exciting time, wonderful opportunity for what's happening here.
Well, first of all, let's just point out this is a nice Texas crew going on. And I like to hear the Dallas connection because that's where I'm from. So, and you're
Sure.
currently at, you said Kyiv Theological Seminary?
Right. Yeah, and I've been teaching here the whole time. We also travel a bit around Ukraine. I've taught in a number of different schools here and preached in different churches, but our home base is here in Kiev. And I'm the director of the Biblical Studies program. So I teach a lot of Bible books. Also, they let me teach the Greek and Hebrew courses, which I very much enjoy. Um, and one of the things you find out when you become a missionary, you probably have had this experience, is that when you become a missionary, you go over thinking that you'll do a certain thing. And then when you get there, you find out all the different things that you're actually going to be doing. And so we've done a whole lot of things over the years, and just uh, it's been exciting, though, to be a part of what God is doing in this particular country. I think the history of this country is powerful and unique, and what's going on is another step in that long history. And we're just thankful to be a part of what God is doing here.
Well, you actually, when you said that, it was reminding me of a conversation I had with a Chinese pastor before we moved to
Huh.
China. He said, "What do you think you're going to do?" Just, yeah, it's not going
Yeah.
to happen. Well, it did for a little bit, but then obviously I'm
Sure,
involved in
sure.
so many other things I never thought I would be
Yeah.
involved with today. So, so you brought up the Ukrainian Christians that went to Dallas Theological in Dallas,
Yes. Uh-huh.
and so let's shift over because you've been in Ukraine. You said for 27 years. That is
Yeah.
barely more than half my lifetime. So that's not a small amount of time. So you've definitely got some experience living in Ukraine long before the war started. Obviously during the war. So what is life like in Ukraine for Christians? Because there is a lot of talk on this side of the pond that President Zelensky and his administration over there persecutes Christians, and somehow Christians are safer in Russia. And I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric about that. So, being there 27 years, you obviously have an idea and a clue of what's going on. So, why don't you tell us what the reality is on the ground?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, and I'm glad to have the opportunity. The short answer to the issue is there is no religious persecution here from the government organized for any religious group. We just have not seen that in our entire time being here. Now, in order to get a little bit more specific, Ukraine is still trying in many ways to leave the Soviet Union. And so culturally, things have been slowly changing. And also, Ukraine is a Slavic country that has been primarily Orthodox for many, many centuries. And they are still Orthodox, except in the West, which is primarily Catholic. And in different places, there have been rivalries, we could almost say, between different religious groups. And so there may be times when evangelicals on some issue might be disadvantaged because they're smaller. There really is no persecution. I teach at the Kyiv Theological Seminary. I've taught in many other schools in Lviv, Odessa, Sumy, Donetsk, a lot of different places. We've been in churches all over Ukraine, and these churches operate freely. And so the whole idea that Ukraine is persecuting Christians, and that is a primary element in this war, that Zelensky, as a president, is trying to behave as a dictator and suppress Christianity is just false. There's no truth to it at all. There was a complication in that you have to understand the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. In Russia, there is one Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. In Ukraine, there are at least three different Orthodox churches. There is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is under the Moscow Patriarch. There is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is under the Kyiv Patriarch. And there is yet another independent Orthodox Church. And so ever since we've been here, those three Orthodox churches have been acting. Now, one of the problems is that the Orthodox Church leaders under the Moscow Patriarch were involved not simply in religious activities, but some of them were actually involved in military spying activities, giving information to Russian forces. And because of that, the government acted against them. But it had nothing to do with orthodoxy. Ukraine is primarily Orthodox. It had to do with collaboration with the invading army, helping them with military things. And so that's completely and utterly different. And so missionaries are welcome here. Western missionaries from all different groups are welcome here in Ukraine. We live here. We've had no problem whatsoever with the government or with people. We are free. On the other hand, Russia has kicked out pretty much all Western missionaries. There is, like I said, one Orthodox Church. The Evangelical Church in Russia is closely watched, and they have great motivation to try to support the government at whatever it does. And this has been one of the difficulties, that the church in many ways between Russia and Ukraine has become divided on this particular issue. But like I said, just to sum up again, that as far as President Zelensky or anything else here in Ukraine, we are not experiencing any persecution. And when I talk to other Christians here, they're coming from all over Ukraine to the seminary, they're coming to the churches that we're at, and there's nothing that they describe that would match that description.
Well, I think that answers the question then. So, I mean, granted, in China, there was definitely persecution toward Christians, but by and
Sure,
large, a
sure.
lot of the rhetoric in the States was very sensationalized in many cases, because
Yeah.
everything we would say was something's true, but it's true somewhere, but not everywhere. But it sounds
Sure,
like in
sure.
Ukraine, while there's no systematic persecution from the government, it's also a very complex environment from a Christendom standpoint because of the
Yeah.
various Orthodox churches and just I think you made a good point. I'm glad you pointed out just the mindset, the cultural mindset coming from the Soviet Union, how that plays into just trying to dig
Yeah.
yourself out of that hole.
Hmm.
It takes time to do that. I mean,
Yes, it does. Yeah.
I've seen that in every country I've gone to. I mean, just where the caste system's in place in South Asia, there's still a caste mindset in the church, even though it's wrong.
Sure,
They've
sure.
got to dig themselves out of it. So yeah, that's thank you for sharing those details because that helps clarify it. So so we've gone from and definitely pre war and your life there and
Mhm.
what you described wasn't just involving President Zelensky in office because you were obviously there before he was ever in office, and I
Right.
think he was what,
Yeah.
an actor or something before he was
Yeah.
president. So you were there when he was just a movie star or something, and and so now we've gone into you go from Crimea, what was 2014 or somewhere
Yes.
around
Right.
there.
That's
So
right.
situation
Yeah.
in Crimea that happened back then, and then you move into it's been 3 years since the invasion.
Right. February 24th, 2022.
Oh,
And so
so
we're
it's
now in
3 years
25.
this
So
month
just
or last month.
a little bit, yeah, a little bit more than 3 years. Yeah.
So I mean, I remember watching the news leading up to that moment, and there was a lot of discussion
Mm-hmm.
whether or not it was actually going to happen or if it was just a threat.
Yeah.
So talk about life kind of leading up to that moment, and then life once it happened, and obviously through the past 3 years.
Right. Uh, I'll try to be brief. Yes, um, so in February of 2022, the Russians moved an army in. And prior to that, probably 6 or 8 months prior to that, the news was filled with stories of Russian forces gathering on the Russia-Ukraine border. And you mentioned that there were a lot of questions as to whether or not the invasion would actually happen. And part of the reason for that is ever since 2014, um, pretty much every couple of months, there were stories about Russian troops massing on the border with Ukraine. And so when we heard about Russian troops massing on the border with Ukraine, it wasn't anything new. This happened quite often, and for quite a long time, whenever we would hear those stories, we thought, okay, maybe this is going to happen, but it didn't, and the stories went away. And so in 2000, uh, right, in as we were getting to the end of 2021, the satellite images, the stories were getting bigger. Um, and the and as we come to February, our mission and all the other missionaries here, their missions were asking the question, should we pull our missionaries out? And so uh, our mission decided to pull us out, and we left on January 31st of 2022, and we went to Poland, and we stayed there for several months before going back to the States for a couple of months. And that was just a very difficult time. And I still remember um, the night we were about an hour behind Kyiv time. And on February 24th, very early in the morning, my wife was taking classes at a school in the States. So it was online and they were live classes. And she was up in the middle of the night in Poland in order to have the classes that were happening in the evening. And at about 4:30 in the morning, she came into where I was sleeping. I was sleeping there because it was in the middle of the night, and she just nudged me and says, "It's started." And from for about a month, we just were watching what was happening. We couldn't get unglued from just the stories of watching the tanks roll in, watching the airplanes, the bombs, trying to keep in touch with our friends and colleagues, and watching them do different things. We were going to a church at the time, obviously in Kyiv, and the church kind of scattered. And for the next couple of months, we tried to keep in touch with the church members, some of whom were in Ukraine, some of whom had now fled to Western Europe. And using Zoom, we were trying to keep in touch with everybody just to find out how everybody was. And it was just a very difficult time. And uh, since then, well, about 6 months later after we left, later in 2022, in August and September, we returned to Kyiv to live, and we've spent some time away, but have been mostly here in Kyiv the whole time. And it has been challenging, but God's really blessed, opened up a lot of opportunities for ministry. And it's just been amazing since Ukraine left the Soviet Union in 1991, 1990, to see the development of the church moving out of the Soviet mindset of a church under the Soviet Union, under persecution, into more freedom. And so, just like Ukrainian society has changed, and Maidan in 2014 was a huge change in the character of the country. Just the attitude, the perspective, the way people behave, the expectations of government and business changed. The church has been changing. And in 2022, when the Russians invaded, we weren't sure what was going to happen. We were very afraid. We knew God was in control, but we just didn't know how it was going to turn out. The church is continuing to change under these new circumstances. And so, since then, to be involved with Christians here at the seminary and in local churches in different cities, it's been just really amazing to see the change in character, the change in the way they do things, the way they think about things. So
So,
I hope that aims towards your question.
yeah, and I have another question for you. I'm just curious. So, obviously,
Sure.
your kids are out of, you said they're all grown. So, they're kind of young adults right now on their own. Why go back to a country in the middle of a war?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll tell you that why go back to a country at war? I will say that we really didn't want to leave. Well, you probably know as a missionary. Why do you become a missionary? Why do you go? It's not simply in order to teach or preach, evangelize. You care about the people. And when we arrived here, we wanted to try to not only share the gospel and teach the Bible, but serve. And so we always recognized that we wanted the Ukrainians to be in leadership, and we are here to serve God. We're also here to serve them. And so over many years, our love for Ukraine grew, our love for the people grew. Well, if Ukraine is all of a sudden attacked, if people are all of a sudden suffering in ways that that you haven't seen yet, your instinct as a missionary is not to run away. It's to increase involvement and increase engagement. And so it was very difficult when our mission said for our benefit, they want us to leave Ukraine to go to Poland or back to the States to remain until it's safe. That's just very contrary to the instinct you have as a missionary. You want to help. And the seminary was not operating for a little while. And after a number of months, the teachers began asking the students, okay, it looks like this war may be going on for a while. Would you like to try to take classes? And many of the students said, yes, we would like to try to do that. And so we still need evangelism. We still need church leadership. We still need Bible teaching. We still need all of these things. Simply because a country is at war doesn't mean you just stop doing all those things. We need those things to happen. And so, like I said, I don't know that's anything unique to me. It's found in pretty much any missionaries. You want to help, you want to serve. And so the country needs help. The country needs people to be doing things. And we're not Jesus, we're not the Savior, we're not the answer, but we can do our part and try to help. And so my wife right now found out about a group of people who are doing things, who are volunteering at the military hospital in downtown Kyiv. And so she goes down on Monday mornings and helps do things there. And so it's just looking for opportunities to serve. And we try to find ways to do that. So it's the missionary instinct. You want to help, and the need is greater than ever. And I pray that the Lord will allow us to keep helping. It's like what you said at the very beginning, you never know what you're going to be called to do, but we want to be available and we want to help.
I think that's a pretty bittersweet description of what's going on. On one hand, you've got the war, which no one likes, and no one wants
Of course.
all of that to be. Nobody wants that. I don't,
No, no,
At
no,
least no one in Ukraine wants that. Put it like that.
no,
And
no.
but on the flip side, I think you make a point, even though you didn't say it specifically, but I have said this many times in the past. God does call families, God does call people into dangerous situations. Okay,
Yeah,
obviously you're aware of the mindset that, among many Christians, that he only calls you to safe places, or if he calls you, he's going to protect you in everything you do, but you're in the middle of a war zone.
yeah,
Yeah, tell that to the 70 Congo or believers in the Congo a few weeks ago, and let's see how that theology
yes.
works out. But anyways, that's another topic. But I think
You're right.
I think on one end, while we want peace and we want all these things to actually come to fruition and for the war to stop, it's actually very exciting at the same time to see not just you and your wife, but to hear about the Ukrainian um, uh,
Yes.
believers and the ones who are pastors, the ones who want to become pastors, and the ones who see it as, look, yes, this crap is swirling around us right now, but
Hmm.
we are still part of a greater kingdom, and because of that identity and that citizenship, we have, in essence, an eternal responsibility to actually keep moving forward. Um,
Yes. Hmm.
not just in trying to protect our lives physically, but really trying to be the hands and feet of Christ in Ukraine, especially in a time like this, because
Yes.
there's many times when, and sometimes rightfully so, missionaries have to leave or flee or get out of situations,
Hmm.
but at the
Yeah.
same time, there's definitely times when God calls people to go back into the danger zones, as we would call them. And
Yeah.
clearly, because 6 days ago, you put on Facebook that the sirens were going off. We're
Yeah.
okay, but hey, just pray for us, okay? Because I remember that post you put out there 6 days ago. So,
Yeah.
with that said, I did ask a question ahead of time in our back and forth, but I actually want to change the question a little bit for you. So sorry for
Uh-huh.
throwing this at you, but the question was really about the tensions between the White House and President Zelensky, but it's been a little bit of time since that's happened, and now the big talk today is about a
Hmm.
potential ceasefire where Ukraine has agreed to certain things. Russia is, as of yet, not agreed to anything, and in fact, in the last 24 hours, President Putin was in his military fatigues on the front lines or something like that. So. Um,
Yeah.
what?
What a dilemma.
Yeah. As someone who's lived there, as someone who's gone through, watched Crimea and watched different things that have happened in the last 27 years, like, obviously we want the peace. Everyone wants the ceasefire. And most people want the ceasefire, and most people want peace. And but what are, how are you viewing this potential ceasefire? How are Ukrainians, because I'm sure it's talked about, I'm sure it's discussed a lot in the news, or just day-to-day interactions. So what are you guys saying on that end of the world about what's happening in our three-letter media outlets over here?
Yeah, perhaps a short phrase to sum it up, and then I'll try to explain a little bit. Painfully skeptical is how they would view all talk of a ceasefire. Painfully skeptical. I used to joke that before I came to Ukraine, I knew everything about Ukraine because I had read encyclopedia articles and I looked at a map. And so that enabled me to know everything about Ukraine. And then I came here, and after 26, 27 years, I find that I know very little about Ukraine. It is complicated. There is a history. And for people who really want to engage with the issue, who really want to understand what is happening, uh, you really need to understand the history. I think for most Americans see this conflict in the abstract. There are two countries fighting with each other. Well, in order to have peace between two countries that are fighting with each other, what should you do? Well, you should have peace. Yeah, let's try that. Let's have peace between two countries that are fighting with each other. And if there's peace, they'll stop fighting. It's very simple. How is that complicated? The thing is, the Russian nation is an empire. It's very large. It has more than 140 million people, and the land mass extends over 12 time zones. Ukraine is very small. Before the war started, we had about 40 million people, and we extend over one time zone. The land mass of Ukraine is a little bit smaller than Texas. Uh, in the last 1,000 years, the last at least 300 or 400 years, Russia has dominated Ukraine, and Ukraine has been a part of the Russian Empire. However, Ukraine has always been a separate culture. There's always been a Ukrainian language. There's a Russian language, but there is a Ukrainian language, and there has been a Ukrainian identity that is uh, a part of the Russian world to some extent, in the same way that Belarus and other places are part of this larger Slavic world. I don't want to actually use the phrase Russian world. That's a very loaded phrase that has its own history and meaning. But Ukraine has tried to be independent. They are a distinct culture. We have had students who come from Russia, that is, before the war started. We'd have students come from Russia to go to school here in Ukraine, and they would talk about going through culture shock. Uh, there is a difference between Russia and Ukraine. And in the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, Russia has always been the dominant uh, element, and Ukraine has had to submit. And so for the last 100, 200 years, there has been an anti-Ukrainian tendency in Russia in terms of language and culture. When the Soviet Union, the October Revolution in 1917 happened, Ukraine saw an opportunity to be independent. But in the 1930s, Stalin and the Russians brought Ukraine back under Moscow's control with what's called the Holodomor. And it was a manufactured famine in which estimates vary anywhere from 5 to 10 million Ukrainians died of starvation. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. We have a lot of grain here, and yet because of Soviet control, Ukrainians starved. And that's a big part of the memory here. In World War II, Ukrainians were trying to get away from the Soviet Union. And so when the Germans came in, many Ukrainians welcomed the Germans as a way of getting away from the Soviets. However, once the Germans arrived, the Germans started killing Ukrainians. And then when the Soviets and Ukrainian military pushed the Germans out, the Soviets said, okay, Ukraine, you like the Germans. Well, we're going to punish you. And so they started killing Ukrainians. And so Ukraine was getting it from both sides. So many things have happened since then. In 2014, as you mentioned, Russia invaded the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, and they also took Crimea, which had been part of Ukraine. Putin in the early 2000s said, Crimea belongs to Ukraine. We have no desires, no designs on getting Crimea for ourselves. It is a part of Ukraine. That is what Putin himself said. Well, 2014 comes along and he uh, just completely throws that away and takes Crimea and begins invading the East. Uh, Many European countries and also the United States tried to broker peace agreements between Ukraine and Russia, and there were many ceasefire agreements, and Russia violated many of them. I think more than 25 at some count. And so to talk about ceasefire is to say, I'm not sure this is going to work. There's one more element, I'm sorry, that I did not mention, and that is in 1994, there was a document, an agreement made called the Budapest Memorandum. Basically, what happened is that in the Soviet Union, the the government of the Soviet Union spread its nuclear weapons not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan. Well, when Ukraine and Kazakhstan became independent nations, those nations, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, still had the nuclear weapons that belonged to the Soviet Union, which at that time in 94 no longer existed. Well, the United States and the United Kingdom, England, and Russia got together with Ukraine and they made an agreement and they said, we want to limit the number of countries that have nuclear weapons. And so, Ukraine, we want you to give us all of your nuclear weapons. And in exchange, we will give you assurances about security. We will make sure that you are protected because having nuclear weapons is a kind of security. Nations tend not to attack you directly if you have nuclear weapons. And Ukraine said, okay, we will give those up. And everybody signed the agreement. And now Russia, one of the signatories of that, has invaded, and the United States and Great Britain have helped a little bit, but really have not done enough to protect Ukraine. And so Ukraine is saying, well, why did we have that agreement? Why did we sign the Budapest Memorandum? If you guys are not going to guarantee that our borders will remain what they were in 1994, give us our nuclear weapons back, and we'll take it from there. But to hear now these different people talk about a ceasefire, Ukrainians are saying, we've been here before. You've tricked us so many times. You have deceived us so many times. You actually expect us to do that. The thing is, Zelensky and the Ukrainian negotiators realize that we don't have a whole lot of choice. And so in Saudi Arabia, they agreed to say, okay, yes, we will agree to a ceasefire. I think Ukraine would probably prefer to have some people watching the ceasefire. Can we get some European troops in here to monitor the ceasefire and make sure that everybody follows it? Because Ukrainians are thinking, okay, well, what can happen is Russia can fabricate a situation in which they say, oh, Ukraine violated the ceasefire, so now we're going to increase military activity. And it doesn't take much to do that, so we need people in here watching things. And so this is a chess match in many ways. And so here in Ukraine, people are waiting to see how Putin is going to spin this. And I think people see that Putin is probably going to say, yes, we will do the ceasefire under these conditions. And there'll be impossible, terrible conditions that nobody would agree to, but it will enable Putin to say, well, we wanted peace, we tried, but Ukraine did not want our offer of peace, and so they are the enemy of peace, and let's get back to what we were doing. So, like I said, painful skepticism, I think, is how Ukrainians are viewing the ceasefire. I Please be assured, we are tired of air alarms. We had an air alarm about 3 hours ago, and we had one early this morning, and there was one in the middle of the night. Uh, Everybody over here is exhausted, and we're always thinking, wondering whether the missiles are going to fall on our building, whether we're going to be the ones that are killed, and pretty much every part of Ukraine in the last 24 hours has been attacked. And so when people talk about Putin desires peace, we have no idea what those words mean. I don't understand what that is supposed to mean. We're not feeling the desire for peace. So I hope that's a little bit clearer.
Well, the thought that came to mind was the boy who cried wolf, as you were talking about the 25 ceasefire agreements that were broken. There's only
Yeah, that,
so much. If you've gone through that many ceasefire agreements and they've been broken, I can only imagine when you start hearing those words again, it's like PTSD. And
it very much is. And so for Americans to criticize Zelensky, criticize Ukrainians, saying, why don't you want peace? Uh, we want peace. But you need to understand Ukraine is under attack.
yeah, and
Ukraine
I
didn't start this war.
and
So, well, anyway,
one of the reasons I asked that question was because I know people are going to think, oh, you're being political now. You're trying to throw this. Of course, they'll probably call me a liberal for even asking the question, with
yeah,
but I think that points to the fact that we're not looking at historical context either.
right, right.
There's a history there. I mean, even in China, there was one point where something happened in Japan, and then suddenly
Yeah,
protests broke out all over China.
yeah.
There was a language school I was in, and there was a Japanese student, and they told him, "Do not leave your apartment this week,"
Wow,
because they were flipping over Japanese cars. If you had a Japanese phone or a Japanese can, they were grabbing it on the street, even if you were Chinese, smashing it to the
wow.
ground. And this had to do with a historical relationship that has been over 100, that started over 100
Yes.
years ago when Japan
Yeah.
invaded and occupied China.
Deep and profound history.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I think it's a good point. You do have to look at the historical, and we just have to be honest in America. We're really bad at that. We're really
yeah,
bad at
yeah.
trying to examine the historical significance of anything, and then we just whitewash it as if that doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
But to most of the world, history does matter, and it's like it's deep rooted in their culture, just as you pointed out. So, in just what you were saying, just as we come to a close, like what would you like for, especially let's say American Christians, like what would you like them to know or hear or consider as instead of just going to your biased preferred three-letter news outlet and saying whatever they say is law, because that tends to be what happens either side of the aisle. Okay, I got friends on both sides of the aisle,
Sure,
and
sure.
that's what they do. But that's not an informed, I mean, that's I wrote down um, informed opinion without considering historical facts. Like you can't have an informed opinion, you can't make informed decisions without
Yeah.
knowing all the information. So what would you want them to know? What would you want them to consider as their process, because they're going to process it one way or another,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's going to influence somehow the outcome of this.
Yes. Uh, well, I would imagine you might feel the same about China with the nations China, Japan, Korea. Wow, the history there. I would ask Americans to understand that the history of this conflict between Ukraine and Russia was a profound, difficult issue before there was a Donald Trump, before there was a Joe Biden, before there was an Obama, before there was a George Bush and a Bill Clinton. There is a history that goes back. Part of the challenge that Americans have is being able to look at international situations and not simply look through the lens of their own political affiliations. And so if President Trump says something to President Zelensky and Zelensky resists or gives a different answer than what Trump was expecting, a typical American response will be to say, oh, obviously, Zelensky doesn't like Trump and is against Trump. That's not the case. This has nothing to do with Trump. The difficulties that Zelensky was facing existed far earlier than Trump, before Trump ever got into politics. There are issues here that are outside of American politics. And so I would ask, request, beg for people in the States to be willing to ask the question, to go beyond the simple interactions between Zelensky and the United States, between Zelensky and Marco Rubio, between Zelensky and Kellogg, General Kellogg, between Zelensky and Vance or Trump. Don't simply respond in terms of American politics, but be willing to ask the question, what is President Zelensky thinking? What are Ukrainians thinking that would cause him to react that way? In spite of what many Americans believe, there is a whole entire world that exists without the United States. And there is a long history here. There are difficulties, there are hopes, there are aspirations, there are problems, there are wonderful things as well. There are great things that we love about this country that have nothing to do with the United States. And so I would just, in the midst of all of this, listen to Ukrainian voices. And not simply Ukrainians who perhaps left Ukraine 30 years ago. The Ukraine that they left no longer exists. The Ukraine of today is a very different country. 2014, the difference between Ukraine in 2015 and 2013 is huge. The difference is very big. Something happened in 2014 that changed Ukraine forever. And what we are continuing to see is a further development of that. If you are able, talk to Ukrainians who live in Ukraine to understand why they respond the way that they do. Don't simply look at things through the lens, is Zelensky a Republican or a Democrat? Those are American categories. Those are American ideas that they don't exist in the same way in other countries. Many of the issues are similar, but there are a lot of other issues that are simply not involved. And so if you want to speak on the Ukraine-Russia war issue, listen to Ukrainian voices. Listen to people who are here. And I want to try to speak, but my voice is not the most important voice. I would always want to defer to Ukrainian voices. Listen to them. And, well, anyway, I would just hope that people can listen to what Ukrainians are saying. So, and also obviously, please just pray. There are exciting things happening. If I could just talk just a little bit about the church here. I apologize if we're going over time, but when the church existed here under the Soviet Union, the church was heavily persecuted, and the church learned to survive. And so they hid. The church was out of sight. It met in secret for the most part. It was infiltrated by the communists, but as much as possible, they tried to stay separate from society, separate from the government. What is changing is that the Ukrainian church is learning how to live under freedom. Now, that's what they've had for the last 30 years, but as you mentioned, I think earlier, it's hard to change. The Ukrainian church was used to living under persecution, and when the persecution stopped, they didn't know how to live under freedom. But since Maidan happened in 2014, and now that the invasion has happened, the church is moving out into society. The church is taking the light of the gospel. The church is looking for opportunities. The church is looking for ways to be involved in society. And so at our school and at the Kyiv Seminary, we have many people who are training to be chaplains. And there's a very large chaplain contingent in the Ukrainian military. Uh, the pastor of our church and many brothers in the church regularly go to the front lines to take food and Bibles and to talk to soldiers, to share the gospel with them and to preach and to pray with them and encourage and counsel them. And of course, this is allowed by the government. The government wants these people to be involved and to serve. And so the church is increasing in freedom and boldness. This development is a large part of what it means for Ukraine to leave the Soviet Union. That is the meaning of the last 30 years, and it's the primary meaning of this war. Putin and Russia want to keep Ukraine under their control. Ukraine wants to be independent and free, and that goes for the church as well. The Ukrainian church is moving out into society, is wanting to be a light, is wanting to make an impact and engage with society to bring the gospel into the culture. And I think this is a very positive thing. And I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of this.
I mean, I think that's a good ending point right there. Just talking about what God is doing through the Ukrainian church and what the
Yeah.
believers are
Yeah.
doing and trying to do and serve their people. Like I said earlier, I'm in awe of people like that. People willing to,
Oh, yeah.
they could flee if
Yeah.
they want to. They could go to Poland. I
Yes.
would assume if they want to, but they're staying and they're doing it because that's where God has planted them. As I've heard over and over in multiple countries, why people are where they're at. It's because, I mean, I know a Palestinian couple from Bethlehem in the West Bank who
Mm.
had every opportunity to come to the United States because they have all their, or the husband has all his siblings here in the U.S. They have the
Mhm.
money to bring him. They've been begging him to come, but he keeps saying, no,
Yeah.
God has put me here for a reason
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
West Bank, but they also serve in places like Jordan and other countries nearby. And they have foregone all those opportunities just to be where God wants them. And I think going back to the beginning of this, what you were talking about of what you wanted to share with Americans, I think a key word that kept coming to mind, or phrase, is just ask questions.
Yes.
Don't assume everything you hear from your favorite politician or favorite
Yeah.
news personality is truthful. Okay, ask
Yeah.
questions. And I know this has gone long, but that's okay because I asked many years ago. I was in a meeting with my pastor and a Muslim imam back in Texas, and
Mm.
this imam had brought this guy with him, and he kept trying to prove that this Christian guy had become a Muslim. And something inside of me is like,
Huh.
keep asking questions. So I kept asking and asking and asking because it
Wow.
didn't. Something seemed off with
Mm.
it.
Mhm.
And he kept saying, well, he comes from a Catholic church, and I was like, okay, that still everything he was saying just wasn't adding up, and I kept pressing, and
Mm.
finally, the kid goes, oh, well, I was a Jehovah Witness.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Ah, now it makes sense. So you
Sure.
kept
Sure.
hopping around from one thing to the next, and eventually you ended up with Islam. And it happened every 10 years. So I just looked at it and said, well, maybe by the time you're 30 years old, you'll figure something else out. The key is always
Yeah.
asking questions, and don't be afraid to ask
Yeah.
questions. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think we're often too afraid to ask questions because we think it may go against what we think is true. And we're afraid of what that might look like. And
Well, and I find most people, probably including myself, we don't like complexity. We want to know who are the goodies and who are the baddies.
yes,
And if you make things complicated, well, then who knows what you're supposed to do?
well, in America, we like
I
everything black
understand
and
that.
white.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but anyways, Mark, thank you so much for taking your time. Thankfully, there wasn't any sirens going off while we were talking.
Praise the Lord. Thank you. Yeah,
Yes, and
really
I'm
glad.
glad you and your wife are doing okay. And just thank you for being willing to share your thoughts and your experiences with us.
So glad to have the opportunity. Thank you.
And for everyone else, thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, and I just appreciate the time. And if you found some value in this, please share this and point people to it, because I really do believe it's imperative that we get perspectives from people on the ground. And while he's not Ukrainian, he does have 27 years of experience in Ukraine, and I think that's worth a whole lot. So please share it. Please point people to it, and I'll see you next time.